The chamber was buzzing with routine chatter when it happened. Senator Tommy Tuberville leaned back in his chair, a smirk spreading across his face, and let out a laugh. Not a nervous chuckle, not a light-hearted grin. No, this was a laugh of dismissal, a laugh that dripped with arrogance. It was the kind of sound that carries a message louder than words. You don't matter. Your voice doesn't count. Across the room. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat upright, her expression calm but unyielding. She didn't flinch. She didn't frown. She simply locked eyes with the man who thought mocking her was enough to silence her. Around them, the air seemed to shift. Staffers shifted uneasily in their seats. Observers craned their necks. Phones tilted upward, ready to capture what everyone could sense. This was no ordinary exchange. The laugh echoed, a hollow sound, bouncing through the chamber, and for a moment it felt as if Tuberville had won the room. But then, freeze frame. In that instant the room gasped, but no one expected what was coming next. Because what Crockett carried with her that day was more than poise. It was more than sharp words or political talking points. Hidden in her folder was something older, heavier, and infinitely more powerful. A piece of history inked on paper during a time when America's very soul was on trial. A letter written by a man who had worn the uniform, who had shed sweat and tears under a foreign sky while fighting for a flag that didn't always fight for him. Tuberville couldn't have known. How could he? To him, this was another sparring match, another moment to flex arrogance before the cameras. But Crockett was holding the weight of her father's sacrifice, the story of a black soldier who had marched into the jungles of Vietnam with nothing but courage and love for a country that too often mocked him in return. And so, as Tuberville's laughter faded into the stale air, Jasmine Crockett prepared to unleash a silence that would cut deeper than any insult. A silence born not from weakness, but from memory, from sacrifice, from the words of a father whose voice still carried across decades. What happened next would not just flip the exchange, it would leave the entire chamber stunned, and one senator. Utterly speechless. For months, Senator Tommy Tuberville had built a reputation not as a statesman, but as a provocateur. His words were rarely measured, rarely careful. They were calculated for headlines, engineered for outrage. Whether it was blocking military promotions over partisan grudges or downplaying the sacrifices of service members, Tuberville seemed to thrive in the role of cultural warrior. To his base, he was a fighter. To many others, he was a symbol of arrogance masquerading as leadership. This was not the first time his laughter had punctuated a debate. He had laughed at questions about veterans' health care. He had smirked when challenged on racial inequality. Time and again, Tuberville's response to the struggles of ordinary Americans was not empathy, but mockery. His laughter had become his trademark, the soundbite of a man who believed power meant never having to listen. And yet across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, a woman who embodied everything his dismissal tried to erase. A rising voice in Congress, young but steady, unafraid of confrontation, yet unwilling to sacrifice her dignity for a headline. Her roots were not in privilege, but in perseverance. She carried the history of her family like armor, the lessons of her father like scripture. Every word she spoke came with weight because it was not just hers. It was inherited, shaped by the sacrifices of those who came before her. That was the stage of this clash. Not simply a senator against a congresswoman, but entitlement against sacrifice, mockery against memory. At stake was not just political points, but the meaning of respect in America. Who do we honor? Who do we dismiss? And whose sacrifices are deemed worthy of acknowledgement? To Tuberville, a laugh was just another arrow in his quiver of arrogance. But to those watching, the veterans, the families of soldiers, the children of immigrants who believe deeply in America's promise, that laugh carried a sharper sting. It mocked not just Crockett, but every parent who had ever written a letter home from war. It trivialized the very sacrifices that built the freedom he so casually enjoyed. Crockett knew this. She knew the weight of that moment, and she knew that silence alone would not be enough. She didn't need to match his laughter with anger, nor his arrogance with insults. What she held in her folder was more powerful than that. It was proof, living, breathing proof, that dignity endures long after laughter fades. In that chamber, it wasn't just two lawmakers sparring, it was America's identity on trial. Would the nation stand with those who mock or those who serve? Would we remember the easy sound of a senator's laugh or the harder truth written in a soldier's trembling hand under the heat of a Vietnamese sun? The answer was coming, because when Tuberville pushed the laughter too far, he unleashed something. No one in the room was prepared to hear. Tommy Tuberville did not come to Washington as a seasoned policymaker or a student of history. He came as a football coach turned politician, a man who made his name on the sidelines and then leveraged that notoriety into power. To his supporters, he was the outsider who would bulldoze through the polished routines of the political elite. But to those who watched closely, his entrance into the Senate revealed something far less noble: an arrogance unchecked by humility, and a tone-deafness that seemed almost cultivated. Tuberville's career in football had been built on the roar of stadiums, the worship of fans, the near-celebrity status granted to men who control the playbook. In that world, authority was unquestioned. When a coach spoke, the players obeyed. When the crowd cheered, it reaffirmed his power. But in Washington, the rules were different. Here, authority was not earned through touchdowns, but through service, through respect, through the hard, unglamorous work of governance. Tuberville, however, never left the stadium mentality behind. To him, the Senate floor was just another arena, and every exchange was a performance for the crowd watching at home. That mentality revealed itself in his words. He once claimed America's military was woke for attempting to reflect the diversity of the nation it served. He blocked the promotions of senior officers, holding hostage the careers of men and women who had devoted their lives to defense, all in the name of a partisan point. He laughed when challenged about the very sacrifices that allow Americans to sit in that chamber and debate freely. Over and over, Tuberville chose mockery where empathy was called for, obstruction where leadership was needed. The irony was sharp. Tuberville had never worn the uniform. He had never marched into foreign soil under hostile fire, never read or written the kind of letter families held close during war. His privilege insulated him from those sacrifices, and yet he positioned himself as judge of those who had borne them. For veterans and their families, the arrogance was not just political, it was personal. To dismiss service with a laugh was to dismiss the blood, sweat, and trauma embedded in the fabric of American history. His tone deafness extended beyond military matters. He stumbled in interviews, confusing the three branches of government, misidentifying key facts about American history, and yet doubling down with bravado rather than humility. Each mistake reinforced the image of a man more concerned with his own performance than with truth. In an era where citizens craved leaders who could rise above partisanship, Tuberville seemed intent on reducing every issue to the cheapest soundbite. And yet, arrogance has a way of backfiring. The louder it grows, the thinner the facade becomes. Tuberville's smirk, his laugh, his dismissals, they were not the habits of a leader confident in his convictions. They were the reflexes of a man afraid to be challenged, afraid to be exposed for what he lacked. And when confronted by someone who embodied dignity, service, and history, his mask of arrogance became brittle. That day in the chamber, as he leaned back and let his laugh echo, he believed he was in control. He believed his mockery would reduce Jasmine Crockett to another target, another headline, another prop in his endless performance. But arrogance blinds. It blinds men to the power of dignity, to the weight of sacrifice, to the voices they cannot hear because they are too busy listening to themselves. And so when he chuckled that day, it wasn't just a laugh. It was the sound of entitlement, a sound about to be shattered. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the polished corridors of Washington, or even in the halls of privilege that so many politicians know by heart. Her story began in the grit of working-class struggle, where sacrifice was a language spoken daily, and dignity was not a performance but a way of life. She was the daughter of a man who had given everything to a country that gave him little in return, and it was his example that would shape the course of her life. Her father had been a young black man when he was drafted to serve in Vietnam. For him there was no option of comfort or avoidance. While some could lean on connections to escape the draft, he answered the call. He stepped into a world of jungles and firefights, of letters written under flickering light, where every word carried the weight of maybe the last time. He fought not for recognition, but for survival, for honor, for the hope that his children might inherit a country more just than the one he had known. When Jasmine was a girl, she would sometimes see him hold that old letter, the one he had written in Vietnam, creased, yellowed, fragile. He never spoke of the horrors, but she could sense them in his pauses, in the distant look in his eyes. When the subject of war surfaced, what he did speak of was service. Service to family, to community, to principle. Those words etched themselves into Jasmine's spirit, becoming a compass that would guide her through the storms ahead. She grew up watching her parents work tirelessly to provide, navigating a world that did not always welcome them. The lessons were harsh but unyielding. Nothing would be given, everything must be earned. Jasmine learned early that her voice had to be steady, her resolve unshakable, if she wanted to carve a place in a society eager to underestimate her. That fire carried her into law. She fought her way through classrooms, through exams, through the constant shadow of doubt cast by those who could not imagine someone like her holding authority. As a public defender, she stood in courtrooms where the stakes were people's, lives and futures, facing systems tilted against the vulnerable. She didn't flinch. She didn't fold. Each case was more than a file. It was a human story, a reminder of the dignity her father had drilled into her. Her path into politics was not a pursuit of fame, but of responsibility. When she stepped into the Texas legislature and later into Congress, she carried the same weight her father had carried in those jungles, a belief that service is not about self, but about others. And while Tuberville built his career on stadium applause, Jasmine's rise was carved out of silence, grit, and perseverance. The applause came later, from those who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles. By the time she reached that chamber where Tuberville sat smirking, Crockett had become more than just a politician. She was a symbol of resilience, of a new generation that refused to be cowed by arrogance. She represented every daughter who had watched her father sacrifice, every family who had felt dismissed by the powerful, every community who had waited too long for dignity. And yet, what made her powerful was not just her words or her position, it was her silence. Because Jasmine Crockett understood something Tuberville did not, that sometimes the most devastating answer is not shouted, but revealed with calm, deliberate precision. She didn't need to match his mockery with fire. She didn't need to meet arrogance with anger. What she carried with her that day was far more potent, a relic of sacrifice, a letter written in sweat and fear, folded and preserved across decades. That letter was not just ink on paper, it was testimony, it was history alive, it was proof that her family's sacrifices were not to be laughed at, not to be dismissed, not to be trivialized by men who had never carried such weight. As Tuberville chuckled in his chair, he believed he had won the room. He believed his smirk could reduce her to silence. What he did not know was that silence was her weapon. Little did Tuberville know, her calm silence held a weapon forged decades earlier on the battlefields of Vietnam. The exchange began like so. Many others in Washington, sharp questions, practiced answers, the dull rhythm of political sparring. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Tuberville, leaning back with that familiar air of condescension, treated the hearing less like a forum of governance and more like a stage for his arrogance. Every word he spoke dripped with dismissal, every gesture designed to diminish the weight of Crockett's voice. "Congresswoman," he sneered, his tone carrying the smugness of a man convinced he owned the room. "You really think you understand what service means? You've never been in a huddle, never led men in battle, never coached a team through pressure." The laugh that followed wasn't one of humor, it was the mocking kind, hollow and sharp, echoing like an insult flung across the chamber. Crockett did not break. Her face was stone, her eyes unwavering. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't fire, back with the anger he was begging her to show. Instead, she let the silence after his words linger, a silence that unsettled those watching. It was the calm before a storm, though no one yet knew how powerful that storm would be. The audience felt the shift. Staffers exchanged uneasy glances. A reporter in the back of the room raised her eyebrows and began scribbling more furiously into her notebook. Onlookers shifted in their seats, their discomfort rising with each smirk Tuberville delivered. It wasn't just that he was mocking Crockett, it was that he seemed to mock the very gravity of the chamber itself, the seriousness of the issues being debated. Social media was already alive. Phones discreetly filmed the back and forth, snippets racing onto timelines. One tweet read, "Tuberville laughing at Crockett. This feels ugly." Another, "She's too calm. He has no idea what's coming." The digital whispers were building, foreshadowing the storm about to break. Tuberville leaned forward now, enjoying himself too much to sense the danger in his own performance. "You're out of your depth," he said with a smirk. "This is the big leagues. Maybe one day you'll understand." Again he chuckled, and the sound landed like nails on glass, shrill, arrogant, dismissive. Crockett's lips parted just slightly, but she said nothing. She let his words hang in the air, forcing everyone in that chamber to feel their weight. She didn't have to raise her voice, didn't have to match his bluster. Her composure was its own kind of defiance, and it unnerved him more than he could admit. The tension was unbearable. Observers held their breath, waiting for her to finally respond. The moment stretched, taut like a wire pulled too tight. Every laugh from Tuberville seemed to draw the chamber closer to breaking. It was no longer just a debate, it was a spectacle, a collision between arrogance and restraint, between entitlement and dignity. And then Crockett moved. Slow, deliberate, she reached down and opened her folder. For the first time, Tuberville's smirk flickered just slightly, as if he sensed something he could not name. Around the room, heads tilted forward, eyes narrowing with curiosity. Reporters leaned in. Staffers stopped shuffling papers. Because in that moment, everyone could feel it. Something was about to shift. And then Crockett reached into her folder, and everything changed. The chamber grew still as Jasmine Crockett's fingers brushed against the folder before her. She opened it carefully, as though the paper inside carried a weight that could not be rushed. The rustle of parchment against the microphone was soft, but in the silence that now blanketed the room, it sounded like thunder. Every eye turned toward her hands, and every smirk on Tuberville's face began to waver. She did not look at him immediately. She did not need to. Instead, she unfolded the fragile, yellowed letter with deliberate calm, her movement steady, reverent. It was the kind of letter that bore history not just in its words, but in the creases and faded ink, the scent of time lingering in every fold. The letter of a soldier, written in the uncertain hours of war, held not just sentences but a heartbeat that had traveled across oceans and decades to land here, in this chamber, in this very moment. The silence thickened. Reporters stopped scribbling. Phones that had been recording almost casually now rose higher, their owners realizing they were capturing history. Tuberville shifted in his chair, his smirk struggling to hold its shape. Crockett lifted her chin, her voice clear, steady, carrying across the chamber without the need for amplification. "This," she began, holding the page for all to see, "is a letter my father wrote in Vietnam. He was 21 years old. He was serving a country that at times did not serve him back. And yet, he wrote these words." She paused, letting the anticipation thicken, letting the room lean into her voice. Then she read aloud. "Dearest family, I don't know what tomorrow will bring. The nights here are long, and the days are filled with fear I will not name. But I think of you. I think of the country I left behind. I think of what it means to fight for freedom, even when freedom has not always been mine. If I don't return, know that I believed in something larger than myself. I believed that someday this country might be as good as its promise." Her words rang out, trembling slightly as if the echo of her father's voice reverberated through her. The room was motionless. Tuberville's laugh, the smirk that had moments earlier commanded the space, now seemed grotesque in memory. No one moved. No one breathed. Crockett lowered the letter, her eyes scanning the room, letting each listener feel the weight of what they had just heard. "My father was not a senator. He was not wealthy. He was not privileged. But he gave this nation his life's risk, his body's strength, his youth. He believed in an America that too often mocked him, yet he served anyway. And you laugh. Her gaze fell on Tuberville then, piercing, unblinking. You laugh at me. But what you laugh at is not me. It's him. It's every soldier who wrote words like these, who carried dreams of a better America, even as they walked through jungles drenched in fear. You don't laugh at me, Senator. You laugh at sacrifice itself. The words landed with devastating precision. Tuberville opened his mouth as if to reply, but no sound came. His jaw tightened, his eyes darted briefly to the cameras, then back, to the desk before him. The confidence that had filled him minutes earlier drained away, leaving him small, cornered, exposed. Crockett, unhurried, turned back to the letter. "If I do return," she continued, her voice softening, "I hope that I come back to a country that respects its people, all its people. That is the America I am fighting for." The silence after those words was not emptiness. It was a silence filled with awe, with reflection, with shame. It was a silence that spoke louder than any argument, for in that moment, history was not abstract. It was not numbers or names in a book. It was alive, present, tangible. It was in her hands, written in her father's words, carried across decades to stand as testimony against arrogance. Social validation erupted beyond the chamber. On social media, the clip was already spreading like wildfire. Hashtags sprang. To life, #Crockett's letter, #Vietnam voice, #service over smirks. Millions of people replayed the moment of Tuberville's silence, the way his smirk dissolved into something resembling fear. Memes showed the senator laughing on one side, and on the other, the solemn words of a soldier's letter shutting him down. Veterans shared their own family letters, their own memories of sacrifice, connecting with Crockett's words as if they were their own dot. Inside the chamber, the weight was palpable. A few heads bowed, some eyes watered. A young staffer in the back whispered, barely audible, "That was her father." Another voice hushed them, "Watch, just watch." Crockett folded the letter slowly, gently, as though closing the past with respect. She slipped it back into her folder, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, steady. But the energy in the room was no longer the same. She had shifted it. She had taken control, not with anger, not with bluster, but with history, with sacrifice. With dignity, Tuberville sat frozen, his hands clasped together on the desk before him. He cleared his throat, tried to summon words, but nothing came. The cameras caught it all, the fall of arrogance into silence, the unraveling of a man who had believed mockery could win the day. For those watching, the contrast was searing. Here was a daughter of sacrifice, wielding the truth of her father's service like a torch. And here was a senator, undone not by insults but by memory. Crockett did not gloat. She did not smirk. She did not need to. Her silence now was more powerful than any shout. She let the weight of her father's words linger, allowed the chamber to sit with them, to be transformed by them. And then she leaned forward, speaking one final sentence that cut deeper than any debate point. "Respect is not given through laughter, Senator. It is earned through sacrifice." The words echoed, final, undeniable. Tuberville lowered his eyes. The chamber was hers. The nation was watching. And as the clip spread beyond those walls, it became clear. This was no ordinary moment. This was the kind of turning point people would talk about for years to come. The shockwaves didn't end in that room. They were only beginning. The room was still echoing with the silence. Tuberville. Left behind when the digital world picked up the story. Within minutes, phones buzzed, screens lit, and the moment exploded across every corner of the internet. A clip no longer than 40 seconds spread like wildfire. Crockett unfolding the yellowed letter, her voice carrying her father's words, and Tuberville shrinking in his chair as if the weight of history pressed him down. Hashtags sprang up instantly. #Vietnam letter, #Crockett strong, #silence. Speaks, each one climbing the charts faster than the last. By the end of the night, Crockett's name trended globally, alongside words that hadn't appeared together in years. Service, sacrifice, dignity. On TikTok, veterans in their 70s stitched the clip with their own memories of jungle nights and long marches, their eyes wet as they whispered, "That's my story too." Twitter's timeline turned into a battlefield of its own. One side mocked Tuberville mercilessly, replaying his smirk and his laugh in endless loops, setting it to clown music, captioning it with words like, "This is what entitlement looks like before reality checks in." The other side elevated Crockett to a symbol, a daughter of service, a voice of the working class, a reminder that America's strength is not built on arrogance, but on sacrifice. Late-night, comedians couldn't resist. Within hours, monologues lit up with punchlines. Coach Tuberville thought he was calling the plays, but Crockett ran the field with her father's letter. Audiences roared, and the laughter this time was not Tuberville's. It was America's. Turning his smirk back on him, journalists dove deeper. Opinion columns in major papers framed the moment as more than political theater. They called it a turning point in how identity, sacrifice, and generational memory intersect with power. Crockett didn't just win a debate, one columnist wrote. She reminded the nation that dignity, when rooted in service and family sacrifice, can humble even the loudest mockery. And it wasn't just the press. Celebrities chimed in. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted, "My dad came home broken from Vietnam. Crockett spoke for all of us tonight." A Hollywood director posted, "That letter should be framed in the Smithsonian." History delivered a mic drop. The retweets racked up by the thousands, then millions. But perhaps the most powerful reaction came from the quiet corners of the country. The VFW halls, the American Legion posts, the kitchen tables where folded flags sit in frames. Veterans, their children, their grandchildren, people who had grown used to their sacrifices fading into the background, felt suddenly seen. Posts poured in, snapshots of medals, grainy photos of young men in uniform, letters written home. From jungles and deserts, each one carried the same refrain. "Thank you, Rep. Crockett, for giving our fathers' words the stage they deserve. For Tuberville, the mockery was relentless." Memes painted him as the man who laughed at service, the senator who sneered until history itself shut him down. Clips of his chuckle became sound effects layered over images of privilege and excess. His silence, once a tactic of dismissal, now became a symbol of defeat. Every pause, every blank stare during that moment was replayed until it etched into the national memory. The laugh that collapsed into nothing. Meanwhile, Crockett's stature grew. She wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She became a vessel for something bigger, a reminder that politics is not abstract, that behind every policy, every vote, there are families who bleed, sacrifice, and endure. Her calm face, her steady voice, and that folded letter came to embody resilience itself. Social validation reached its peak when veterans organizations issued public statements. One declared, "Jasmine Crockett reminded the nation tonight that respect for service is non-negotiable." Another wrote, "We may be divided in politics, but we stand united in honoring sacrifice." Crockett honored it. Tuberville laughed at it. Those words ricocheted across headlines and feeds, hardening into a narrative too powerful for spin to undo. But the ripple effects went further. Across immigrant households, families who had long felt their contributions overlooked found validation in Crockett's stand. Her father's letter became a metaphor, not just for Vietnam veterans, but for every parent who had sacrificed so their children could sit at tables of power. It was a story of grit, of legacy, of defiance against dismissal. And that was why. The clip refused to fade. It wasn't just a debate moment. It was a mirror. America saw itself in Crockett's hands. The pain of service, the pride of family, the dignity of resilience. Tuberville's laugh became the foil, the arrogance. Of forgetting. The internet raged, wept, celebrated, and mocked. But underneath the noise, something settled deeper. A shared understanding that this clash had touched more than politics. It touched the soul of what America claims to value. And yet, even as the applause swelled online, the story was far from over, because the letter, that fragile paper carried from battlefield to daughter, was not just a relic. It was a weapon, one that would shape the battles yet to come. When the echoes of laughter had faded, and the silence of Tuberville's stunned retreat lingered, Crockett did something remarkable. She didn't gloat. She didn't sneer back. Instead, she reframed the entire moment not as a personal victory, but as a lesson in values. Dignity, she implied through her composure, will always outlast arrogance, and sacrifice will always outweigh entitlement. This wasn't just about a senator's misplaced chuckle, it was about the deeper truth. America is not held together by smirks and sound bites, but by the quiet endurance of those who gave more than they had. Crockett's father's letter, fragile with age yet strong in meaning, reminded the nation that service is not something to be laughed at. It is the bedrock of the republic. She spoke to something beyond politics. In that chamber, before cameras and colleagues, she reached into a space every American recognizes: the need for respect, respect for service, respect for family sacrifice, respect for the stories written not by the privileged, but by those who carried rifles in jungles, drove supply trucks through deserts, and wrote home by dim candlelight. Her father's words weren't just his alone anymore, they became universal. In them, the public heard echoes of every soldier who never made it home, every veteran who came back changed, every family who sat at an empty dinner table. Crockett had taken what Tuberville tried to belittle and elevated it into a moral mirror for the nation. Patriotism, she reminded us, is not measured in loud claims nor in hollow slogans shouted from podiums. It is measured in sacrifice, in those who gave up comfort, safety, and sometimes their lives so that others could enjoy freedoms often taken for granted. To laugh at that is to laugh at the very heartbeat of America. And that is why Tuberville's silence carried such weight. For once, words failed him, because against sacrifice, arrogance has no rebuttal. Against service, entitlement collapses. Against dignity, mockery disintegrates. Crockett's calm smile in the aftermath wasn't just composure, it was a declaration. It said, "You cannot shake what is rooted in truth." And the truth was that her father's letter wasn't just paper, it was proof. Proof that the measure of a life is not in what you take, but in what you give. As commentators replayed the moment, one theme cut through the noise. Crockett turned an insult into a universal lesson. Her father's words weren't a weapon of attack, but a shield of dignity. She didn't expose Tuberville by shouting him down. She exposed him by lifting up something bigger than both of them, the meaning of service. And in doing so, she gave America a reminder it desperately needed. Patriotism is not laughter at others, but reverence for sacrifice. It is not about who can mock the loudest, but who can honor the quietest acts of courage. In living rooms across the country, families talked differently that night. A veteran's daughter saw her own father's legacy in Crockett's voice. A young soldier preparing for deployment felt recognized before he even left. And countless Americans, jaded by endless bickering in Washington, glimpsed something rare: moral clarity. Her father's words crescendoed into a truth larger than politics, larger than partisanship. They reminded us that the strength of America does not come from arrogance in the halls of power, but from the sacrifices of those who wore the uniform, carried the burden, and returned, sometimes broken, sometimes whole, to a nation that too often forgets. Crockett's final lesson was simple yet profound. Dignity is power. Sacrifice is legacy. Respect is patriotism. And America's truest strength is found not in the laughter of privilege, but in the service of those who never asked for applause. As she folded the letter again, the message was clear. This was not just her father's voice. It was every father, every mother, every child who had ever served or sacrificed for this country. Her father's words reminded us. America's strength is not in laughter at others, but in the sacrifice of those who served. In the end, the moment could be summed up in one sentence. Tuberville laughed, but the Vietnam letter left him speechless. The contrast was stark. His smirk versus her silence, his mockery versus her father's words. One was shallow and fleeting, the other timeless and unshakable. And that's why this moment resonated far beyond the hearing room. It wasn't about who scored political points. It was about a deeper truth, that dignity and sacrifice will always silence arrogance. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to trade insult for insult. She let her father's letter, a voice from the past, carry the weight, and it crushed the arrogance before her. That is what real power looks like. But here's the bigger lesson. This isn't just about one senator's laughter or one representative's response. It's about what kind of country we choose to be. Do we want a politics built on mockery, or a politics that honors service? Do we want to applaud arrogance, or do we want to amplify dignity? Moments like these remind us that history isn't rewritten by those who laugh the loudest. It's rewritten by those who carry the truth, even when it's unpopular, even when it costs them dot. So here's your call. If you believe America must honor service over entitlement, share this story. Share it with your friends, with your family, with anyone who thinks politics is just noise. Show them that dignity still has a place in our public life. And if you want to keep amplifying voices like Crockett's, voices that refuse to bow to arrogance, then subscribe. Together we can make sure the truth doesn't just survive, it triumphs.